Hey, Kyle here again, introducing you to After Effects. If you're just starting here, you might want to go back and watch the first video, where we learned about the basics of After Effects, how to create and work with keyframes, and we focused on animating using mostly the transform properties. For our next steps, we'll continue expanding on those same ideas. But before we get back into After Effects, I want to show you some important ideas about how to structure your designs to avoid creating a big mess for yourself later. First things first, After Effects uses the RGB color mode. If you have designs built for CMYK, you'll need to convert those before you can import them into After Effects. In the world of video, things are always measured in pixels, and we're just working at screen resolution here. So if you have files created at a higher DPI or PPI, that doesn't really get you anything, although it technically doesn't hurt either because pixels are pixels. Remember though, since we'll be animating things and the scale of a layer can change over time, you'll want to consider the maximum size you might want to see that element, and maybe create it just a little bit bigger than that to give yourself some flexibility. In general, that flexibility is the thing you really want to keep in mind here, because designing for animation is all about anticipating the ways you might want to move each particular element. For example, I'm here in Photoshop and I have this circle, which needs some textured shading. A lot of designers would select the circle, create a new layer, paint on that texture, and then call it good. But if we take a closer look at this texture layer, oh yeah, it only exists within that circle shape, which means we can't animate this separately from the circle without seeing that edge. Just like the texture layer in our first example extended way beyond the edges of the canvas, you need to think about the ways you might want to animate each layer or group of layers, and so how much of that thing needs to exist. I would structure my textured circle more like this, where we have two groups of individual brushstrokes, each of them on their own separate layer, and then those groups are masked so things look correct here in Photoshop. In After Effects, it gives you the flexibility to animate every single brushstroke individually if you want to. And so that structuring that started in Photoshop is the difference between the circle on the left and the circle on the right, and what a difference that makes, huh? While I don't have the time here to cover every single detail of building and importing in both Photoshop and Illustrator, here's a quick overview. Every Photoshop layer can become an After Effects layer. Groups will be imported as something called pre-compositions. That's one composition nested within another one. As you just saw, Photoshop text can be converted into editable After Effects text. Most layer styles and some effects can actually stay editable and then be animated in After Effects. I should point out that smart objects don't get any special functionality. They're treated like any other Photoshop layer, so if you want After Effects to have access to those internal pieces, you'll need to add them into your Photoshop file directly. After Effects also doesn't recognize Photoshop artboards, so you'll need to split those into separate files before import. For Illustrator files, every top-level layer can become an After Effects layer. Anything within that top-level layer, whether it's just one thing or hundreds of individual pieces, will all be imported as a single layer. Illustrator layers can be converted into shape layers in After Effects, which means you can actually edit and animate things like fill, stroke, and even the actual vector paths. Illustrator text unfortunately can't be converted the way Photoshop text can, but you can easily copy-paste that text or even vector elements between the two apps. Again, After Effects won't see multiple artboards, so those need to be saved out as separate Illustrator files. Make sense? Good. How about we dive into another example and put this stuff into practice? We're here in Illustrator looking at this logo for Bloom Bubblegum. That's probably another one of our silly puns. We'll see soon enough. But the important thing is that each of these letters is its own layer here in Illustrator. See, we have our B, L, O, O, M. You get the idea. And for these, we just made the flowers one whole layer by itself because we don't really need to do any internal animation with these pieces. We're just going to animate this as a single object here. And so one layer is plenty. This looks all ready to send over to After Effects, so let's do that. I'm here in a blank After Effects project, and to import that file, I could also just grab it directly from my file browser. Here's that Bloom logo AI file, and you can just drag that directly into After Effects if you don't want to use the other import dialog. Like before, we'll get a pop-up here. It's just a little bit different for an Illustrator file, but the options are pretty much the same. You want to make sure you choose Composition, and then this is set to Layer Size, and then we'll hit OK. Once again, we'll get a composition and a folder with some layers in it. We can just double click that. And this is the first time that we're working with a file that doesn't have a background layer. So if you come down here, you'll see that you can toggle your transparency grid if you'd like that, but I'm going to work on black. Let's come up to our composition settings. The name is fine. I would like to change the height and width and a few other things here. Let's go ahead and uncheck this lock aspect ratio. Let's just make this a pretty big square at 2200. Then you can hit Tab to go to the next field, 2200. And then we'll set our frame rate at 30. And let's go ahead and make this nice and long. I don't think we'll need all of this, but just to be safe, let's set this to 20 seconds. If you'd like to change the background color, you can do that here. You could make it this fabulous Adobe red, for example, but I think I'll just leave it as black for now. And then hit OK. To zoom in and out of your timeline, you can use the plus or minus keys up at the top of your keyboard, or you can also click and drag on this little slider down at the bottom of that panel. Now, since I increased the duration of this composition, I'll need to select all my layers and extend those out to the end of the timeline. Let's hop back to the beginning of our composition, and just to do a little housekeeping, let's select these first 5 layers and set those to, maybe orange, just so it's easier to see the difference between the 2 words here. And I'll click down here to deselect. The first animation I'll do is on our 2 flower layers. So I'm going to go ahead and select both of these. You can do it up here in the viewer as well. And if you use Shift or Control, you can select both of them. I'll come over here and make a keyframe on rotation, and then jump to the end and maybe spin these up to about 90. That's probably plenty. Do a quick preview. Okay, that might be a little slow. So let's jump back up here. And with both of them still selected, we could spin that up to about 180. Maybe that's enough. Yeah, we don't want them too fast, just enough to show that they're moving. Although, you know what? Looking at this, I think it might be interesting if they were turning in different directions. So let's stop our preview. And we could select either one of these. I think I'll take the top one. If you click on the word rotation, it will actually select all the keyframes on that property. And then if you right-click on either of them, you can choose right here, Keyframe Assistant, Time Reverse Keyframes. So that'll just swap all of these to go backwards. And let's see how that feels. Okay, I think that's a little more interesting. Now I'll create a scale animation for each of these letters to come on. We'll start with the top word. Let's jump to our home point, and we'll start with B right here. I'll just work directly in the timeline this time, so I'll hit S to reveal the scale property. And let's go ahead and create a scale keyframe here. So if I hold Shift and press page down 1, 2, 3 times, I'll jump up to frame 30, or 1 second, since we're in a 30 frame per second comp. I'll go ahead and create another keyframe up here, and if I jump back to frame 0, I actually want that scale to also be 0. That'll give us this quick scale up animation, and that's okay, but it could be more interesting. What I'd like to do is come to frame 20 and actually create another keyframe here that goes above 100, and then we settle back down to its actual size. So let's come in here and type 110 on either of those fields. Hit home and then preview that. Okay, better. I'd like to smooth out these keyframes just a little bit, so I'm going to draw a box around all of them. Or again, you could click on the word scale. And again, I'm going to right-click one of these, Keyframe Assistant, and then choose this option, Easy Ease. Or you can just hit the F9 key, which is probably what you'll want because this is a pretty common thing. You'll see the shape of the keyframe changes, and if we watch this again, smooths everything out. I'll talk more about that later, but for now, we'll just use that. Now I'm going to jump back to home, select all of these, and come up to Edit, Copy, or you can hit Control or Command C. Then I will select each of these orange layers. You can do Select Label Group, or you could Shift select them. And then I'll come up to Edit, Paste, or Control or Command V. And we'll paste that same keyframe across all of these layers. If we hit U, we'll be able to see all of them, plus those couple rotation keyframes we made before. So let's preview that. Okay, nice. And since that's the same property across all of these, it worked to just copy paste all of them. Like we did in our first example, I'd like to time offset these a little bit just to make this a little more interesting. So let's come back to home. We can hit plus to zoom in just a little bit. Let's move forward 2 frames using page down, and then we'll grab this layer and just bump it over. Page down, bump this over, page down, bump this over, page down, bump this over. And now we've got a nice little time offset happening that should make this visually a little more interesting. There we go. I think we can go ahead and close up these orange layers. And now we'll do something similar with the bubblegum layers. Let's come back to 1 second here so that we can actually line up with this other animation that's happening. I'm going to select all of these layers, hit P to reveal position, and create a keyframe. And you'll see it creates that keyframe on all of the selected layers, even though these are different values right now. In addition to using your page up and page down, you can also jump between keyframes using J and K keys. So I'll hit J to jump back to the previous keyframe. And with all of these layers selected, I'll just drag them upwards just a little bit in the viewer. And then I'll hit Home to jump back to the very beginning and drag these all the way off the bottom of the composition. You can either just keep dragging until it pushes it, or you may need to zoom out a little bit to make sure you see it correctly. We'll come back down to the timeline, getting a little harder to see everything in here. I'll select all of these and press F9 to easy ease that again, and let's preview. Okay, pretty nice. We're going to do that same little offset trick here, but I think first I need a little more room to see my timeline. Let's grab this line right here and we'll just drag this up so that we can see the panel a little better. And then if you hold spacebar just temporarily, you'll get a hand tool and you can reposition your logo to see it. And I'll throw one more shortcut at you. You can use the open and close bracket keys to move a layer's in or out point to the current frame. So if we go page down twice and then select this layer, you can hit open bracket to move the layer to that time. Page down, select, open bracket. Page down, select, open bracket. Let's jump back to home and do one more preview. I think that's feeling pretty good, but I would like to take these layers and maybe bring them over just a little bit so they start at about frame 5 or 6. Let's say 6, just because. There we go. That feels pretty good. So we have a nice logo reveal here, and then we have some elements that keep moving just to keep it alive for as long as it's on screen. There's one more little touch I would like to do here, which will be easiest if we do something called pre-composing. Pre-composing is a lot like making a smart object. You're kind of packing this group of layers up into one container. You can still easily access it, but this way you can treat that group of layers as one single layer in your timeline. I will select all of these bubblegum layers, and you can come up here and choose Layer, Pre-compose. Of course, we'll want to give this a meaningful name, so let's call this bubblegum, and hit OK. And now it's packed all of those layers away into one layer. But we can still access those by just double-clicking on that, and you'll see it has all of those same layers and even all the same keyframes. We can go ahead and close this back up. What I'd like to do here is just add a little bit of an accent color here. So let's take this layer, come up to Edit, Duplicate, so that we make a second version of it. And if we jump up to our first frame, zoom in a bit, we can just nudge this top copy over one frame. If you drag your cursor over, you'll see now we have kind of a second copy of our bubblegum. And if we use a fill effect to make this a different color, it'll give a cool look. So let's come over to our effects and presets and search for the fill effect. And we'll drop that straight onto the bottom copy. You'll see it turn red, which is the default color. And if you look up in your effect controls, you'll see you have a color picker right here. And I happen to know that the color I want is B0D2A0. I'll hit OK. And now we have the secondary copy of our text that adds a nice accent color. I'll come up here and make sure I save my project as Bloom Bubblegum. We could totally stop here and use this logo as a standalone element, but we're actually going to use it as part of a larger animation that we're about to create. I'm here in Photoshop with this 3-panel design that would be used as a social media carousel, where the user flips through each of these images themselves. And if you're designing something like this, you're already thinking like an animator because you're telling a sequential story. In that case, it's just the user that gets to decide the pacing. We could certainly export these 3 images and turn them into a simple animation using the skills you've already seen. But hopefully you're already starting to see ways that we could take this quite a bit further. And what you're able to do with this concept will largely come down to the way that you structure your design. Instead of three separate frames, we could instead come up with one single design that unifies all of these elements, and then we could plan to show this in a single square frame as we move the design through that, as well as animate some of the individual elements. Here I've prepared that file in Photoshop. You have this file too. It's called bloombumblegum.psd. And you can see we have those same three images here, just all created in one unified design that will make it easier to send to After Effects. If you look over at the layers panel, you can see that I've done some grouping, and I've also put elements together with the other items that are in the same location. Now, when you create Photoshop groups like this, these will become pre-compositions in After Effects. So in this case, having these elements all pre-composed into the background works well. And having these elements pre-composed into a texture layer works well. But I think I'll actually ungroup these accent elements because having all of these kind of tucked away in a pre-composition might make it hard to animate those individually. So I'll just quickly ungroup those. In my opinion, it's usually a little easier to send more top-level layers over to After Effects, and then you can organize and condense stuff in there as needed. This looks good, so I'll go ahead and save this file, and we'll hop over to After Effects. We'll just keep working in this same After Effects project. So let's come up to File, Import File, and grab that Bloom Bumblegum PSD that we just saw. And we'll make sure to import that as Composition Retain Layer Sizes. Open up that composition, and there we go, just like we saw it in Photoshop. You'll notice this also brings over the guides from Photoshop, which can be really handy. You can come up to the View menu, and you can turn those off or snap to them or not, a lot of your sort of standard controls you'd expect. You can also show rulers right here, which you can also get with Control or Command R, and then you can pull guides out just like you would expect from the other design apps. I'll just tuck that back away and turn off the ruler. Looking down at our timeline, you'll see that unfortunately the layer colors from Photoshop don't come over, so we'll need to recolor those. And the names are kind of a mouthful right now. If you pull this out, you'll see it's giving both the layer name and the document name, which is more than we probably want to look at. So right here where it says source name, if you click on that, you can toggle it to just the layer name, which is easier. Of course, you could click on any of these and press enter if you wanted to rename it, but I don't feel like we need to right now. Just bring this back over. So we're looking at a triple wide composition right now, which is not what we need. Remember, the original frames were just 1080 by 1080. So we need to change our composition settings to what we actually want to deliver this at. We'll just come up to composition settings here. And we should be able to just choose the social media square 1080 by 1080 at 30 frames per second preset. That's perfect. And for the duration, I think 10 is probably enough here. So we can just change that to 10 seconds and then hit OK. All right, this is perfect, but everything's in the wrong place right now. So we'll need to fix that. There's a lot of layers here. So I want to think about which one I want to be able to move as kind of my main animation. And in this case, that's the background layer. So we're going to take advantage of parenting again. And in this case, we're going to parent every other layer to the background. So if you hit Control or Command A, you'll select everything. And then you can use either one of these drop-down menus or the pick whip, either way, and just link all of those to the background layer. It won't link to itself, so you don't need to worry about that. And now if we change one of the transform properties on our background layer, you'll see that everything else goes along for the ride. And that is exactly what we want here. Let's go ahead and do our main animation of this sort of scrolling sideways. We'll maybe start right here at 1 second and create a position keyframe. But we're obviously not at the correct start position right now. Now you could certainly eyeball this and maybe you could find the right spot, but we can actually use just a little bit of very easy math with After Effects doing the work for us to get to exactly the right spot. Now remember, this layout is exactly 1080 times 3. And right now, if we're in the middle and we want to be in the middle of this section, that means we're exactly 1080 pixels away from where we need to be. So if we come down to our position property, or of course you could do this in the properties panel, same thing. If you click on the X value of your position, press the right arrow so that you deselect that number, and then type plus 1080, enter. After Effects does the math for you, and it gets us to exactly where we want to be. Now I'll hold Shift, press page down, 1, 2, 3, to jump up to 2 seconds. And because I was paying attention, I saw that that previous value was 540. So there we go. Jump up one more second, 1, 2, 3. And now we need another copy of this same keyframe. So you could click on this little icon here, or again in the properties panel, where you can also simply copy paste that existing keyframe and then jump up one more second. And we need to be exactly right here, which means in this case, we could again come over here and type minus 180 this time. That'll bring us to exactly the right spot. Bring our cursor back to the front and do a quick preview. Okay, we're getting there. I'd like to make a few adjustments to the timing, and then we'll definitely want to smooth this out as well. I think we'll give each of these screens just a little more time. So let's bring our cursor to 115, 1.5 seconds here. I'll just select all of these keyframes by dragging a box around them and just move them up to start right there. I think 1 second is enough time for that move, but I want to give another ½ second for this screen. So let's bring this one up to 4 seconds, right in between those. And then just select these two keyframes and drag that up. And then let's preview that one more time to see how that timing feels. That's a little better. It gives more time to read everything and moves along nicely. Then a nice amount of time on our final logo. Okay, like I said, there's one more thing I want to do, and that's easy ease these keyframes so that they don't look so hard and mechanical. So F9, easy ease, one more preview. Yes, much better, much better. Now that we're working in a more complex project, a few of you may be starting to see some performance issues with your machine. Remember that After Effects is built to be a graphics and compositing application. It's thinking about all the pixels every frame. So as you stack up more layers and effects, it has to work harder to do that. So let me show you a few workflow tips that can help you work and preview much faster. When you're focusing on animation versus the final look, you don't necessarily always need to see everything at full quality. At the bottom of your viewer panel, you have the ability to change the resolution of what you're seeing. In this case, we'd probably be fine with half or third. We've got this pretty small up here anyway, so it's really not going to matter too much. If you choose auto, it will automatically set itself to the resolution that's appropriate for the magnification that you're looking at, which in my case is half. And I think that's plenty. When we export this, it will still be full resolution. It's just going to make it a little faster to work right now. I'd also like to come over and tweak my preview settings so that we get a little better performance there. Your preview is probably at the top of this column, and if you grab this little bar right here and drag down, you'll actually have quite a few more preview settings. There are a couple options in here, and you can change these to whatever you prefer. Personally, I like having this range set to the work area. We're going to be changing that quite a bit as we work through this animation, and I like having it restricted to exactly the area that I set it to. So that's what I'm going to choose. I also like to play from the start of range instead of the current time. You'll notice I've been very careful about setting my cursor back to the beginning every time we preview, and if you set this to start of range, you don't need to do that. If you are seeing playback issues, you can also adjust some of these settings right here. You probably don't want to touch frame rate. Auto is the setting I would recommend here. Especially for newer folks, I would not recommend previewing at a different frame rate than what you're actually trying to work at. It can be kind of confusing. But over here, this resolution can actually be set differently than your viewer. So if you'd like your previews to build more quickly, you could specifically set your preview resolution even lower. So you could have the viewer set to one resolution as you're looking at a static frame, but set to a different resolution when you're watching previews. You can also choose to skip frames to build the previews even faster. If you're just roughing out the timing, for example, you can save yourself a lot of processing by skipping frames, and then turn it back up as your animation gets more refined. And lastly, you actually have several different shortcut keys that you could use to do previews. And the power user tip here is that you could set each of these differently. So you could set spacebar to be a full resolution preview with all the frames, but you could set numpad 0 to be a low res preview that skips a bunch of frames. Again, it's just all up to you and how you like to work. And one last tip to help you work a little faster. If your machine seems like it's slowing down, you can come over to your Edit menu and choose Purge. Purging these disk caches can free up the memory that After Effects uses to build your previews. So if things are feeling slow, just come over here and try one of these. All right, hopefully we're all running a little faster now, and we'll know how to stay that way. So let's dive back into that animation. Before we animate anything else, let's go ahead and color code these other layers, because it's kind of just a big block of the same thing right now, and it makes it pretty hard to look at. For my line A and B, I'm going to go ahead and set those to blue. For Gumball through B, I'm going to set those to this seafoam color. And this would have been a little easier to do if I'd remembered to do it before I trimmed my comp down. But if I Control Select, Made with Flowers, Up Tier, In Flavor, and Powerful Pollen, those are all the cyan layers. So I'll set them to cyan here. And then we have Organic, Nectar, and the Bloom logo. I'll set to orange. There we go. Much better, and it very quickly becomes easy to see each little group here. And now that we've done that, we're actually going to dive into this background pre-composition. Remember, in Photoshop, this was a group, and so it means it comes into After Effects as its own nested composition right here. So if I double-click this, we can go inside, and we'll be able to animate these layers in here. Let's do a little color coding in here as well. Maybe set these flowers to red. And I think the rest of the stuff is probably okay. We could go ahead and just lock this background color because that doesn't need to move at all. For these flowers, we're just going to give them a little bit of subtle rotation. So I'll select this first one here. And let's do this up in the properties panel just because. I'll go ahead and create a keyframe for rotation. And remember, our other main composition is only 10 seconds long, so we really only need this to be moving for that long. I'll just set this to maybe 45 degrees. I don't think it needs to turn that much. And because we have all this dead space back here that we're never going to see, let's go ahead and trim that off of the work area. Now, again, we could drag this like this, but there's some shortcut keys that make this much faster. To set the beginning of this work area, you press B. To set the end of the work area, press N. Now, I do want this beginning to be back at the home, so I'll just reset that, but we'll be moving these around quite a bit when we get back out to the main scene. Let's do a quick preview, and remember, I don't need to move this back to home now because I changed that preview setting. There we go. I think that's just going to be a nice, subtle rotation, just enough to keep the background alive. Now, I'd like to copy that to the other flowers, and I absolutely could click here and copy paste to those other ones. I'm going to show you one other technique that's really helpful when you want to link multiple things with the same animation and maybe don't want to have to keep updating multiple layers. If I select both layer 2 and 3 and hit R to reveal their rotation property, you might notice that under that parent and link column, we parented layers before, and that's very helpful. But you can also use this little inset pick whip right here to link properties directly. So if I take this rotation property and I use the pick whip right here to link it to this layer's rotation, now this text will turn red and you'll see a little twirly right here. And that's because it entered what's called an expression. These are a little more advanced, but this wasn't hard at all, was it? We can do the same thing for the other layer. Just link it to this one. And now these are always going to have the same rotation value as this layer. So if I start scrubbing through, you'll see as the top one changes, the other ones always change. This is a really helpful technique if you think you might want to edit that value again. This way you're only needing to make those changes in one place. With a quick preview, we'll see, yep, they are all indeed turning. Nice, slow, and subtle. I think that will be perfect. We could bring in a little more life by animating these texture layers, again, just pretty subtly. I think just the grid and the wash texture will do the same thing. We could make position keyframes on both of these, or we could parent one of them to the other and move both of them. It's really up to you. I'll just come back to home. I'll hit P to reveal position and make keyframes on both of these. And you know what? I think I'm going to go ahead and move these down just a little bit. Now you can see one of these layers, the grid, is actually only as big as the composition, but in this case, we won't see that difference, so it's okay. I'll hit K to jump to that next keyframe, taking me to the end of where we need this. And then we can just move this upwards, either in the viewer, or you can use your arrow keys to nudge layers. So just a little bit there. Or similar to the way you can jump more frames using the Shift key, if you hold Shift and press the up arrow a couple times, you can move these quite a bit. Let's maybe zoom in just a little bit so we can see that more clearly and do a quick preview. Yes, I think that's going to be great. We have some nice life in the background, but it's still pretty subtle and it's not going to grab too much attention. Let's go ahead and close this pre-composition and see how this feels up in the main comp. I'm going to drag this just a little bit bigger so that I can zoom in and see pretty much the whole thing. This starts becoming a little bit of a balancing act here because we have a lot of layers, but we also want to be able to see. So you just need to kind of decide your own preference and make adjustments as you need. Let's do a preview. Boy, animating that background really adds a lot of life, doesn't it? That's a pretty simple trick to be able to add a lot of motion without having to do anything too difficult. We're going to animate this text in a minute, but I'm noticing these lines that would be such a great way to lead our viewer through the scene. Right here, we have this one, and then just a bit later, we have this very curvy one up here. Let's go ahead and work with this one first. And so I'll just park my cursor somewhere right between these two keyframes. And while I still have my background selected, I'll just press U so that we only see those keyframes and it hides the rest of the properties. This will be my line A right here. So we have a couple different ways that we could reveal this. But since this one is pretty simple, I think a mask will do the job very nicely. Come back up and grab our mask tool and just draw a rectangle around that. You'll see how it kind of reveals it as you draw. In this case, I ended up with a mask color that's a little hard to see up in my viewer. So you can color code these as well by clicking on the chip. Let's just choose something darker, maybe a dark pink. There we go, much easier to see. If you twirl open your mask right here, you can actually keyframe the mask path. So let's go ahead and make a keyframe for this. Just come back a few frames. We're going to need to adjust the timing in a minute. And then if I hit V to go back to my selection tool, I can animate this entire mask right here. Just drag it off to the left, and then you'll see it's revealing that line as it animates. Now that's going to be awfully fast, so we probably want to match this up. I might need to drag this back up here, and this mask reveal should probably be about the same speed as our background movement. When you're dragging keyframes around, you can hold Shift to make them snap to other keyframes. And since we're just focusing on this movement right here, this would be a good time to maybe go around here and hit B, and then go around here and hit N. And so we can just preview this short section of the animation to see how it feels. Okay, not too bad. I'm going to go ahead and easy ease these with F9, press U to collapse that down, and then I might just sneak this a few frames earlier. Let's see that. Yes, I think that works better. It just kind of leads you a little bit right before this starts. We'll also go ahead and start trimming some of our layers as we work with them. So in this case, this layer doesn't need to exist until this first keyframe because it's not visible until that happens. So we could actually trim this layer off right here. Now, normally you can grab the front of a layer and drag it around. You can do the same with the end. But in this case, I already moved that off the beginning of the timeline. So I'll use a shortcut key instead. At exactly this keyframe, if I press Alt or Option and the open square bracket, you'll trim your layer off. Remember earlier, we moved a layer by using the square bracket keys by themselves. So you can move a layer with just the square brackets or trim them without moving by holding Alt or Option. And then we can actually scrub up here until this one is off screen, maybe around here. And then we could press Alt or Option and the close bracket to trim that off. And so as we start doing this with all of our layers, it will be much easier to see what is on screen when. Let's do the same with this second line here. This looks like a good frame to work on it. So let's grab another mask and see how this works. Again, we got kind of an odd color, so let's just set that to something darker, a little easier to see. And I'll grab my selection tool. And thinking about it, this may not work as well with a mask because as we reveal this, we're going to have this area right here. So we can kind of just work through this right here. This drop right here is all going to happen at once. And I think that's going to be a little bit severe. So I'm actually going to delete this mask and try a different technique. I'll come over here, select the mask, and press delete. I'm going to come up here and grab my pen tool right here. This works just like the pen tool in Photoshop and Illustrator. And with this layer selected, I'm going to click and drag and do my best to trace this path. If you just click, you'll make straight lines like this, and those won't be quite precise enough in this case. I'll just undo those. So you want to kind of find your curves and then just click and drag to pull out these tangent handles. And just do your best here. It might take a little practice. There we go. And if you need to make any adjustments, you can just hit V to go back to your selection tool and do any little touch-ups that you think you might need. So now we have a mask, but in this case it's open, so it's not hiding the layer. We're going to use this to drive an effect to reveal this line for us instead. I'll come over to the effects and presets and type in stroke and find the stroke effect under generate. We will add that to our layer right here. You may see a little bit of a white line on your layer originally. That's just the default setting. Let's come over to effect controls, maybe change this to something easy to see like a red. And then I'm going to turn up this brush size until it covers my dotted line. You could also come back and make any tweaks that you need to your path. But again, if we turn this up just a bit wider, we really aren't going to need to be perfect here. I'll just turn this up to, there we go, 6 or 7, that's plenty. And then we'll be able to use either the start or end value, I'll use end in this case, to animate this line along the path. And then we'll use that to reveal the layer underneath it. So let's go ahead and make one keyframe for end, move back just a few frames using page up, and scrub that all the way down to 0. We can hit U to reveal those keyframes, page down to move forward a frame or two, just so we can see this. And now what we actually want is not to see this red line, but for that to reveal the layer. So we need to choose Paint Style, and on this drop-down menu, select Reveal Original Image. And now we can see our original layer again. We just need to time this better. So let's drag this keyframe to match up with this one, and this keyframe to match up with this one. Again, we could hit J to jump to this keyframe, and Alt or Option open bracket to go ahead and trim that. Grab both of these, F9 to easy ease, and like this one, we probably want to move it just a little bit earlier. We can come up here to our work area, drag this over a bit, and now we'll do this preview and see how it feels. That might be a bit fast. Let's try that again. Let's go ahead and drag the second keyframe a little bit later. That feels much better. So it looks like I ended up just a few frames beyond that move. Looks like I'm at 503, but you can put this wherever you'd like. Now I'll hit Home to go back to the beginning and press B to stretch out my work area. Let's go ahead and make this a bit smaller so we can see the whole thing. And let's watch this whole first portion to pay attention to these lines. There we go. I really like that. Notice how these lines really lead us from scene to scene. This is called eye trace, and it helps you lead your viewer through your animation. When used effectively, you can direct your viewer's eyes to exactly where you want them to look. We're going to work with the smaller blue text first, so I'll control-click both of those, and we're going to animate the position property, so I'll hit P to open that up. Then I'll nudge this by holding Shift and pressing the left arrow once, maybe twice, and then make a keyframe. We'll move forward a bit on the timeline, and then Shift right arrow twice to get back to the original position, and then twice more to balance that out with those first keyframes. And so this is going to give just kind of a nice little drift on these layers. That feels a little fast right now, so we'll go ahead and drag these over and see how this works out. Okay, I think that'll be fine. And then I think it might be a little more interesting if they were moving in 2 different directions. So I will highlight these 2 keyframes on the lower of the 2 layers, right-click, Keyframe Assistant, and choose Time Reverse Keyframes. That's just going to swap them. So now that same animation happens backwards. There we go. I think that's pretty interesting. And once those layers are off screen, again, we could trim them. So we'll come to this keyframe right here, and we could select both of those and Alt or Option, close bracket. Now let's do the same with these up to your and in flavor. I'll just select both of them here, shift and the arrow to nudge them over, add a position keyframe using whichever method you like, jump up just a few frames, nudge them back to the right, and then let's go ahead and bring those keyframes out. I bet about halfway through those moves would probably work fine. And since I'm moving these anyway, I could just manually reverse these by grabbing the second one, moving it up front, and moving that one there. Let's see if that's enough. Oh, they need to be just a little further, just before they come on screen. I'll grab both of those, adjust them over. Go ahead and trim these layers off while I'm here, and then move up. And it looks like we need to be right here. So let's move these keyframes over just a bit and trim those layers off. And see how obviously we've got some stragglers right now, but this all will feel much nicer in the timeline once we get everything tidied up. Yeah, that's nice. And for powerful pollen, I think that would be nice if it sort of slides over to meet this line right as it lands. So let's grab this. We could go ahead and just move this over to trim, open up our position, create a keyframe for where we want it to land, and move back a bit, and just kind of decide how far you want it to slide. It's up to you. We'll move this over to the beginning of the layer and just kind of make sure we time that so it happens just before we would see it. Maybe one more frame. There we go. And we might want that to land just after that other animation stops. And we could probably just ease only this second keyframe. Let's maybe watch just that portion. So I'll come here, press B to shorten my work area and see how that feels. Not bad. I might tweak this just a little bit, move it up so that move happens just a little bit slower, bring this back over just a few frames later. This is the part where you need to just kind of watch it and adjust until it feels right. I'll maybe move that back just a frame or two. That feels pretty good to me. Okay, now let's come back and work with these big hero text pieces. I'll bring my work area back up front here and maybe extend it just a little bit. And we'll work with organic to figure out the look, and then we'll be able to apply that to Nectar as well. You might remember from before that it's pretty easy to convert a Photoshop text layer into editable After Effects text, and that's what we're going to do here. So let's go ahead and do both of them at once. I'll shift select this Nectar layer. We'll right click and choose Create, Convert to Editable Text. You'll see their icons change to text layers, and now we can work with them. In this case, I'm going to apply an animation preset again, just because that's easy. I'm going to choose one called Slide In from Comp Edge. That's a newer preset that I think will work really nicely. Let's just drop that onto our organic here, and you should see it disappear because it's the beginning of the animation. If you press U, you'll see the keyframes here, and we're about to make some other adjustments. This preset gives you quite a few controls up in your effect controls. And so if you scrub through, you can see what's happening. In this case, it's animating the entire word at once, which is not really what I want. And it's happening from the top, which is also not what I want. But you have all these handy controls right here to change that easily. I'll change this one to bottom, and I'll change animate by from word to character. And so now this preset is actually aware of the size of your composition, and it's going to animate each character from the bottom up into position. I think that feels pretty nice. I think I would actually like this one to start with the O a little higher. So let's come back to our home, and you can actually take this completion slider, because this is a 0 to 100 again. So I'll just scrub this value up a bit until this O is just touching that little gumball. And let's see how that feels. Yeah, I like that. We're not waiting so long for that to get up into place now. Okay, let's do something similar with Nectar. We'll go ahead and adjust our work area here, maybe something like this. Let's go ahead and grab that same preset and apply it to our nectar layer. And it's important to note that when you use an animation preset, it gets applied at the frame where your CTI is currently located. So that first keyframe is right there, and then you can see the second one. Let's go ahead and press U so we can see those better. And we'll come back up here, change top to bottom, and change word to character again. And then just quickly scrub through. Okay, that looks good. We just need to adjust the timing. Scroll down in our timeline just a bit so we can see those keyframes from the background. And I think this animation probably needs to start just before that is revealed on screen, maybe around here. So we can grab those keyframes and scoot them over and go ahead and trim our layer right there. And let's preview. Pretty good. I might drag this second keyframe just a bit to slow that down. Maybe not quite that much. All right, let's watch it in context with the first one and see if they both feel good. I'm happy with that. Let's go ahead and save our work. And to match what we did on the logo animation, which we'll add to this in just a second, I'm going to duplicate these layers and add a secondary color to them. So let's come up here with organic. We'll grab that layer and hit Control or Command D to duplicate it. And then we'll nudge this top copy over one frame. You should see that here in your viewer. And then we'll select the bottom copy. And over in your properties panel, you have a fill right here, and we can eyedropper this to this light green. And so we get that same kind of, oops, we probably need to just nudge both of those over one frame to fix that. Good enough. There we go. And then we'll do the same thing for nectar. Control or Command D to duplicate, move the top copy over one frame, select the bottom copy, and then eyedropper to that pale green. And again, give that a quick look. I think that feels nice. We'll go ahead and bring our cursor over here, and let's add that animated logo that we created earlier. I'll come back over to my project panel. Let's close that up so we can actually see what we need. And this will be our bloom logo that we created earlier. I'm just going to grab that and bring it down into my composition. And you'll notice as I drag vertically, you can choose where in the layer stack this new layer goes. So I'll just bring this down and put it right above this other bloom logo. It's a bit too big right now, so we'll need to adjust that. Let's come down here in our timeline, and on this new pre-composed version of our bloom logo, we could hit S to open up the scale and just scale that down until we find the right size. If you want to be more precise, you can hold Control or Command while you scale. I'm finding this a little hard to match up, so I'm going to show you a little trick. If we click right here to toggle these switches and modes, we could choose a blending mode that makes it a little easier to match this up. Let's choose the difference mode, and then anything that's exactly the same will turn to black. So we can just use our arrow keys here to nudge this layer around until we get it into just the right spot. That looks pretty perfect. Obviously the flower's a little different because they're animated. Now that that is set, I will put this layer back to normal and delete our original bloom logo because we don't need that anymore. But we do need to make sure that this new one, which we can go ahead and turn orange, we need to make sure that that is parented to the background like everything else. And then we'll figure out the timing by just scooting this over to somewhere during those two keyframes where we're moving into position here. Let's come around here, hit B to set the beginning of our work area, and we'll drag this out a bit just to kind of make sure that lands at the right time. That feels pretty good to me. We're getting really close. We've got all of our major pieces animated, but paying attention to the details, even if you're just adding something subtle, is the best way to make sure your animation will be really engaging. Let's go ahead and jump back to the very beginning of our composition, and we'll quickly animate this star shape, which is right here, layer 14. This is getting a little cluttered, so let's just hit Control A to select everything and twirl these closed. We could do a little bit of trimming as well. Organic is off screen, so we can trim that away. And then up here, when nectar gets off screen, we can trim that away. And again, it becomes very easy to kind of see each group of layers here. So let's do the same with our star shape. That white one is off screen here, so you can trim that. We'll work with this one right here, which comes on screen right here. So we'll trim in, move down a bit until it's off screen, and trim out. Now let's extend our work area back to the beginning here. Let's select that down in the timeline, and I'll reveal the rotation property by pressing R, make a keyframe here at 0, and we'll probably place this second keyframe near the end of the layer, but we won't really be able to see that because of the move. So I'll kind of just eyeball this, bring this value to, I don't know, 22, 23. That's probably enough. And then we'll just scoot that keyframe over to the out point of the layer. Let's do another quick check on that. Perfect. And we'll do something similar with this one. I think rotation might be a little weird since it only has 4 points. Let's maybe try scale on that one. So we'll press S to open up the scale. Let's bring that down to maybe, I don't know, about 80 or so. Make a keyframe. We can take that up towards the beginning of the layer. And then we'll go up to around 100 or maybe just over. Again, this is kind of up to you. And normally I would be careful about going above 100%, but I don't think it'll matter too much on that background shape. Let's quickly press End and then the N key to set our work area so we get to watch the whole thing, and let's see what we think. I think this is feeling pretty good. There's another detail I'd like us to look at though. You might remember the technique we used to animate the texture in our very first example. You could use that exact same idea here. Let's just double click that speckle texture, which is another pre-composition. And you'll see inside here, we actually have 2 layers, a white and a blue. You may not be able to see much of the difference here. I would just zoom out. Let's go ahead and change one of these to a different color, just so it's a little easier to see. And then I would come back to the very beginning of the composition, select both of these, press P to reveal position, make a keyframe for both, and then we can go ahead and set these to hold keyframes now by right-clicking, toggle hold keyframe. And now any keyframes you create on the rest of this will all be hold keyframes. So you can decide for yourself what rhythm feels good. You could make another keyframe every second or every 15 frames. That's up to you. You probably also noticed these other great green details, like these little gumballs. And here you have a few more and this other little green shape. And then you have this fun little bee friend here at the end as well. I'm certainly seeing some opportunities to bring those bits to life, but I think this is a good place to go ahead and wrap up our lesson. And I'll leave it to you to finish up those elements on your own, if you'd like to. When you're done, make sure to save your project and then export your animation, just like we did earlier. Most importantly, share it with someone whose opinion you trust and ask if they have any feedback for you. This is a great way to start learning what other people will notice and to help you start developing that eye for yourself. Thanks again for watching. In the next video, we'll explore techniques for creating elements directly within After Effects itself. And then, of course, we'll make the move. See you then.